Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us here in Seoul, Korea, my birthplace, for the Global Peace Convention at this momentous time in Korean history. I would like to thank the many leaders here in the One Korea Global Campaign, Organizing Committee, the Korean Parliamentary Society, Action for Korea United, and the Global Leadership Council for their support and commitment, and to welcome our many distinguished guests and friends of Korea from around the world. Let us give all of them a round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, all Koreans, North, South, and in the diaspora, trace their origins back millennia to the mythological story of Dangun, the ancestor of the Korean people. Running like a thread throughout our 5,000-year history is the philosophical idea of Hongik Ingan, which roughly translated means to live for the greater benefit of all mankind. It has always been a guiding principle throughout Korea's tumultuous history in periods of crisis and national renewal. Representing our historic cultural DNA, it allowed Koreans of every generation to connect to our heritage and define our future legacy. Understandably, the Hongik Ingan ideal was a motivating ideal for the independence movement that sought to create a new republic out of the ashes of the Joseon dynasty. It shaped the aspirations of the independent leaders to want more than freedom from Japanese colonial occupation. Based on this ethos, they believed that it was their destiny to create an ideal nation that would be an example to the world. The most significant milestone of the Korean independence movement came in 1919. On March 1st of that year, more than 2 million Koreans, 10% of the entire population, coalesced in a groundswell of support for the Korean Declaration of Independence, proclaiming it peacefully in mass rallies across the nation. Known as the Manse or Samil movement to Koreans, it marked the first non-violent civil protest to Japanese and European colonial rule, inspiring other national movements for independence throughout the 20th century. We are gathered here to celebrate the centennial of that historic moment and recognize the heroic efforts of our forefathers. Although a homogeneous people, Koreans have been inspired by Hongik Ingan throughout their history to seek universal truths from all philosophical and religious traditions. Unlike other Asians, Koreans were willing to embrace the Western values of freedom and human rights, the political ideals of a constitutional republic, as well as Christianity, as we struggled to define our future. This was reflected in the Korean Declaration of Independence. It appealed to the high ideals of liberty, equality, and the innate right of national self-determination. Hearkening to the American Revolution, it highlighted the self-evident truths that are the basis for a world of conscience in line with a higher power and peaceful progression of history. Korean independence was seen through the lens of fulfilling Korea's national destiny instead of mere condemnation of Japan. And I quote from the Declaration itself, "Today, our duty is to rebuild ourselves, not to demolish others." It continues by stating that to boldly right old wrongs, opening new relationships based on true mutual understanding, is certainly the best way for both countries to avert disaster and foster amity. meaning with Japan. Thus, for the architects of the Korean Declaration, one of whom was my great-granduncle, Reverend Moon Yoon-guk, one of the most influential Christian pastors of his day. The Samil movement sought to stay true to the high ideals of Hongik Ingan. They recognized that, and I quote, "With the well-being of humanity at stake, the establishment of Korean independence is a grave issue that transcends the mere animosity of two nations." Eventually signed by 33 signatories representing Christianity, Buddhism, and Cheondogyo, as well as civic and cultural leaders. The Declaration stayed true to the spiritual roots of Korea's founding and reinforced its sense of providential destiny. Ladies and gentlemen, the United States played a great role in shaping the geopolitical landscape of Asia and the fate of Korea throughout the 20th century. With the end of the Great War, it was President Woodrow Wilson who drafted the 14 points, whereby one of those proposals mentioned the need for national self-determination for all colonized people, inspiring the Samil movement of 1919. Yet due to weak American leadership, Wilson's vision fell apart in the feeding frenzy as Allied powers vied for the imperial territories of the Central Powers. Instead of building a better post-war order, the Versailles Treaty paved the path for Japanese imperial ambitions in Asia. Because the West recognized Japan to the exclusion of every other Asian nation, it legitimized its sense of Japanese superiority over its neighbors. This would lead Japan on a collision course with the United States in Asia, and eventually the entrance of the US into the Second World War. The unconditional surrender of Japan in 1945, however, offered the United States a unique opportunity to influence the geopolitical order of Asia once again. It single-handedly defeated the Japanese Empire and stood as the world's only great superpower. Europe was in shambles, with the colonies of Europe and Japan seeking national self-determination. In this vacuum, the US could have righted the wrongs of colonialism and brought freedom to the oppressed people of the developing world, in line with the aspirations of the Korean and other subsequent independence movements. This would have been the best bulwark against communism and the Cold War that was soon to follow. Sadly, this was not to be. Inviting the Soviet Union into the Pacific theater due to the concerns of excessive casualties in the invasion of Japan, the US inadvertently allowed the Russians to influence the geopolitical landscape of Northeast Asia. The peninsula was divided into a zone of influence along the 38th parallel, very much like Eastern Europe. In 1948, two separate governments were created in Korea, permanently dividing the peninsula. When the Soviets successfully tested their own atomic bomb in 1949, the US no longer stood as the world's only great superpower, ushering in the nuclear age and the beginning of the Cold War. Ladies and gentlemen, the creation of the Republic of Korea, ROK, in the south and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north was a direct product of the Cold War, with both governments, however, seeking to unify the peninsula from its very founding. Interestingly, the names of both nations is or ends with the Republic of Korea, which harkens back to the independence movement, reflecting their common root. Eventually, the North's failed attempt to unify Korea by force led to the Korean War in 1950. The fighting ended with an armistice in 1953 that solidified the division and left the hopes of the independence movement still unfulfilled. While the military stalemate remains, the two Koreas developed in very different directions. The miracle on the Han has transformed the South into the 12th largest economy in the world today. The North's economy, however, has declined to become a dysfunctional basket case. The only national achievement has been its nuclear program, surprising the world with the speed at which it developed nukes and a missile system to threaten all of its neighbors, including the United States. In response, President Donald Trump's administration made Korea the top international priority of the U.S. for the first time since the Korean War. It imposed biting sanctions and galvanized global support to enforce those sanctions. In addition, it projected a credible military threat to counter the North's nuclear program. This aggressive American approach, with the full support of the international community, especially the North's former allies, forced the hand of Kim Jong-un. Ironically, Kim Jong-un's nuclear ambition became the very catalyst for former geopolitical rivals, the US, China, and Russia, to come together to contain him. This lack of geopolitical experience created a perfect storm of global condemnation on par with the United Nations response to the outbreak of the Korean War. Yet, unlike 1950, the North stood completely alone. Ladies and gentlemen, the complete isolation of North Korea by 2018 was a historical diplomatic achievement, largely due to strong American leadership, Kim's naive geopolitics, and circumstances all coming together to create a unique opportunity. Yet instead of capitalizing on this tremendous inflection point to shape the future of Korea, the United States kept its blinders on in pursuit of an unrealistic narrow goal of complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of the North. This revealed its lack of strategic vision for the peninsula, the region, and the Pan-Pacific Rim. Squandering this opportunity, the U.S. has merely reacted to the events on the peninsula rather than helping to shape a new geopolitical reality. Out of desperation, Kim Jong-un reached out to the newly elected president of South Korea, Moon Jae-in, for a lifeline. Representing the legacy of Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, it was natural that Moon would see the North's overture as an opportunity to pursue a Sunshine Policy 2.0. This will build his and the left's political capital domestically, as well as give him international bona fides as a peace broker. What followed was North Korea's participation in the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics and 3 highly publicized inter-Korea summit meetings between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un. It appeared that the South Korean president's initiative to engage the North was easing the tensions on the peninsula. Yet, the larger issue of global sanctions led by the United States, as well as its military option to take out the North's nuclear capabilities, remained a real threat to Kim Jong-un. Astonishingly, once again, Moon took extraordinary steps to advocate for direct bilateral talks between the United States and the DPRK, breaking with long-standing diplomatic practice. This set the stage for the Singapore summit, the first ever face-to-face meeting between a sitting president of the United States and North Korea. This summit would give Kim the legitimacy his predecessors could not achieve, and thereby increase his stature at home and abroad as an equal to the American president. Once he stood utterly alone, yet with the help of the South Korean president, he now stood as an equal with the very man who nearly brought him and his regime to the brink. The Singapore summit was to be his greatest comeback. The Singapore summit exposed the flaws in American policy. In return for dismantling its nuclear program, the United States was prepared to aid the North's flagging economy and even ensure the survivability of the Kim regime. In so doing, the U.S. was willing to forfeit its basic values by ignoring the North's atrocious human rights record, as well as cementing the two-state reality on this peninsula. Although Kim agreed to some vague terms of denuclearization, few believed that he had any intention of abandoning his nuclear weapons, and many were alarmed with the extent to which the U.S. was willing to go in these bilateral negotiations. Ladies and gentlemen, the U.S. fails to see that the North's nuclear program is more than an insurance policy against Western aggression. It is Kim's crowning achievement in the face of a hostile world. For Koreans, whose fate had been determined by foreign powers throughout the 20th century, the need for independent self-realization is a powerful force and therefore admired when exhibited even by Kim. In addition, giving up its nukes would undercut the very legitimacy of that regime, which was built upon the propaganda of their importance to the North Korean people. The loss of credibility to give up something so central to the Kim dynasty due to foreign pressure would damage the regime internally more than any enticements from the U.S. would benefit it. Although Trump feels that he is on good terms with Kim, the DPRK will not give up their nukes, no matter what they promise. More importantly, American policymakers fail to recognize the nuclear issue must be understood within the larger strategic framework of unification. Kim Jong-un and the North Korean ruling elite are an intergenerational dictatorship that have not abandoned the dream of Kim's grandfather, the eternal President Kim Il-sung, of a united peninsula dominated by the North and its ideology. Remember, it was Kim's grandfather who instigated the Korean War. Unification has always been the stated goal of both Koreas, and something the North has been preparing for decades, with its ties to South Korean labor unions and elements of the ideological left. The North has a larger strategic view of a unified Korea that can reap the benefits of the South Korean economy with the might of their nuclear weapons program. And what they can no longer achieve by force, they will seek to achieve by geopolitical maneuvers and exploiting the hyperpolarized ideological divides in South Korea. They will seek the official end of the Korean War so that the U.S. would be pressured to remove its military presence from the peninsula. They will appeal to anti-American and anti-Japanese elements of the progressive left in the ROK under the banner of Korean self-determination to erode the fragile alliance in Northeast Asia between South Korea, the U.S., and Japan. And by doing so, create an opportunity to create a new nation in their image. American policymakers need to recognize wider strategic issues at play beyond the narrow issue of denuclearization. Following the first summit between Trump and Kim in Singapore, South Korea's President Moon Jae-in pursued an evolving policy of greater cooperation with the North at the expense of his allies. He called for the relaxation of sanctions and the declarations of the end of war between the two Koreas and the United States, to the chagrin of the U.S. and Japan. The Moon-Kim summits acknowledged Korean unification as a stated goal. On September 19th, 2018, in his speech at Rongga-do Stadium to the North's elite, Moon stated that he and Kim pledged to hasten a future of common prosperity and reunification on our own terms. This statement was made under the principle of autonomy of our people, where we ourselves determine our own fate, meaning the two Koreas and no other parties. With an impetus towards unification underway, the most important strategic question for the United States, the region, and the world, but most importantly the Korean people, will become what sort of unification will that be? What sort of country will the new Korea be? This is where the battle for the future of the peninsula will be fought. Yet, how many South Koreans are aware that their leadership has made a tacit agreement for unification? Why is there no debate on the future of unification here in South Korea? Why is North Korea negotiating with the United States in Vietnam to the exclusion of the ROK, when it would surely be the most affected by whatever outcomes happen in Vietnam? The stakes are just too high. There should be a transparent process where the Korean people in the South, North, and the diaspora are participating in the debate for unification on the peninsula with the support of the international community. Ladies and gentlemen, I have long recognized the need for an out-of-the-box approach to unification ever since my father, the Reverend Dr. Sun Myung Moon, pioneered the opening to North Korea through his groundbreaking meeting with Chairman Kim Il-sung in 1991. I was disappointed then to witness what followed. Although my father's intent was to work towards unification in line with the ideals of the independence movement, the South Korean government at that time had no overarching strategic plan or objective except engaging the North. What soon followed was the Sunshine Policy. This policy of engagement opened the door to the reclusive DPRK, yes, where every chaebol, religious, civic, political group, and NGO, as well as international governments and entities, rushed in to the North. Huge amounts of capital poured in from official and unofficial sources, enabling North Korea to raise the funds it desperately needed to survive and later develop their nuclear program. The North's economy at that time relied heavily on Soviet subsidies. When the Soviets collapsed in early 1990s, the DPRK was in serious jeopardy. What could have been a tremendous opportunity for unification was squandered due to the lack of leadership here in South Korea and the United States. Although unification has always been the stated goal of South and North Korea, due to the ideological nature of their respective plans, neither plan is accepted by the other. With a clear lack of a clear objective, the policy of engagement reinforced the ideological, social, political, and economic divides of the two Koreas, leading some to wonder, like my good friend the ambassador, if the division of the peninsula could ever be bridged. A new approach was needed that broke out of the Cold War framework and could appeal to both sides. Such an approach is encapsulated in my book, Korean Dream, Vision of a Unified Korea. First, I look to our common history and culture as an ancient people, beyond the divisions imposed upon us by outside forces. The common thread that ties all Koreans together is the founding mythology of Tangun and the ideal of Hongik Ingan. It is the very root of our Korean identity. The 74 years of division of the Korean people is but a drop in the bucket of our 5,000-year collective history. Our Korean identity was the common thread that held our people together throughout the ages, allowing us to overcome tremendous challenges. The division on the peninsula is a challenge of our generation, but it is by no means insurmountable. Secondly, I started with the end in mind by clearly stating that the purpose of unification should be to create a new nation in line with our cultural historic heritage. It encapsulated the aspirations of the independence movement from which the leadership of the two Koreas had come together, and thus made it relevant for the discussion of a new unified homeland. In so doing, I put the emphasis on the outcome rather than the process of unification, thus presenting a focus that looks beyond the current opposing ideological differences, and thereby enabling the dialogue to start from a blank slate. As a student of American history, I knew that the United States, which most agree is a paradigm of freedom and human rights, became the type of nation that it is because of its ideals and its founding principles and values. They are the skeletal frame upon which the flesh of democracy and free enterprise takes form. Yet when we consider the rich and ancient history of Korea, we have been blessed with so many of the ideals, principles, and values that resonate with those championed by the United States. A nation built upon that foundation would truly be a model nation due to our ancient pedigree and the fact that we will have overcome the horrors of colonialism and the division of the Cold War. Ladies and gentlemen, great social transformation requires active engagement of a broad public united in pursuit of a common cause. That cause should be unification. Koreans from the north, south, as well as the diaspora must engage with one another on many different levels. Civic organizations and NGOs are the perfect means for such engagement. Understanding the need for a broad civil society coalition, I have been instrumental in launching and developing the Action for Korea United. Since its launch with key partners in 2012, it has grown rapidly into the largest citizen-driven movement for unification in the history of South Korea. And now it includes nearly 1,000 organizations. Let's give them a round of applause. It is making unprecedented progress in building civic consensus, bridging political, religious, and regional divides, and collaborating with governments and other stakeholders to promote the cause of unification among Koreans everywhere. AKU organizes grassroots community education programs based on the Korean Dream approach in provinces throughout Korea and in the diaspora. These are coupled with activities through which participants, including refugees and defectors from the north, experience making unification a part of their everyday life. AKU is also building broad support and enthusiasm for unification, especially among the young, through culture and the arts. Most notably with new unification songs and the 1K concerts featuring award-winning artists and top K-pop groups with significant reach and impact through social media. In addition to these vital efforts, AKU has joined with the Global Peace Foundation and other partners in the One Korea Global Campaign to advance the unification agenda with a wider public appeal. From expert forums like this one to youth exchanges, cultural initiatives, and social media, it is building awareness and generating support for a unified Korea on virtually every single continent. Many of you are already actively engaged in this campaign, and I invite the new ones that are gathered here to join us in this vital cause. Ladies and gentlemen, while we're gathered here, critical negotiations are underway between the United States and the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. At the second summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim, concluding today here in Vietnam, not here, but in Vietnam. The main reason for this summit is a lack of substantial progress on denuclearization from the first meeting in Singapore last June. I urge the ROK, US, and the international community to recalibrate their approaches. As a concerned Korean, I believe the citizens of South Korea should be alarmed in the misdirected actions of this current administration. Appeasement of and advocacy for Kim's regime is not a strategy, nor would it lead to anything productive for the Korean people. Unfortunately, the North understands the weakness of the South's hyper-partisan political environment. It is no coincidence that the North historically only engages with left-leaning presidential administrations and not conservative ones. My book, The Korean Dream, offers a new framework for unification that can appeal to all Koreans in the South, North, and diaspora, rooted in our collective heritage that defines our destiny as a Korean people. I wrote this book to empower all Koreans to be the masters of that destiny and to fulfill the dreams of our forefathers of creating a model nation in line with the Hongik Ingan ideal. As a good friend and famous contemporary poet, Ji-ha Kim, said about my book, "My dream, your dream, our dream, all come together in the Korean dream." If every Korean becomes the owner of this dream, I'm confident it will soon become our collective reality. Most of all, I believe that the U.S. should abandon its narrowly defined denuclearization policy and widen its Korea focus. It should view this issue within the larger context or framework of unification, especially since it is already being actively considered. Like the Marshall Plan in Europe and MacArthur's reconstruction of Japan did after World War II, the U.S. should have a larger, longer strategic view of Korea in relation to its neighbors and to the Pan-Pacific Rim. Remember that both those plans led to a post-war alliance that was the bulwark against communist aggression, providing global security and unprecedented economic growth. Likewise, a unified Korea that is built upon the ideals of Hongik Ingan would naturally align itself with the West since it shares its values of liberty and human rights. In addition, it would be an indispensable peace broker bridging East and West in the most dynamic region in the world. As a result, a unified Korea should become the clearly stated and actively pursued policy of the United States, with the support of the community of nations. In doing so, it will help the Korean people bring closure to the legacy of colonialism and the Cold War that has plagued our people throughout the 20th century, and open up a new chapter of freedom, unity, and global prosperity in line with our providential charge to be a benefit to all humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, the centennial celebrations that we will be attending tomorrow remind us of the dreams of our forefathers to create an ideal nation. I would like to share what Kim Gu, the head of the provisional government of the Republic of Korea in Shanghai, wrote more than 100 years ago. And I quote, "I wish my nation would be a nation that doesn't imitate others, but rather it be a nation that is a source of a new and higher culture, and thus true world peace come from our nation." Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Korean dream: to create an ideal nation and lead the world to peace. What would happen if a new unified nation is created that reflects the Hongik Ingan ideals of living for the greater benefit of all humanity? Would it not benefit all Koreans, both North and South, especially those families divided by the 38th parallel? Would it not benefit the region with a Korean nation friendly with all its neighbors beyond ideological divides and true to its historic identity as an advocate for peace? I pose these questions since the creation of a new nation is still a dream and not yet a reality. But what would happen if everyone gathered in these centennial celebrations were to have that same dream, reminded of the sacrifices of our forefathers during the Samil movements of 1919? As Genghis Khan observed 700 years ago, if one person has a dream, it is but a dream. But if everyone shares in that dream, it becomes a reality. Now is the time for far-reaching vision, wise leadership, and bold action. Korea's historical quest for one free, independent sovereign nation is no longer a distant dream. It will be the reality of tomorrow. Let us all become the owners of the Korean dream and realize the Korean dream together. Can we do that? Yeah. May God bless you and your families. And once again, let us dream the Korean dream. Thank you very much.